Grand Rising, Grand Rising. Okay, how's everybody doing? We're going to go over some big money patterns that occurred yesterday. And I will, let me see here. This is 11:26. All right, we'll get started right about there. And turn this thing down. Oh. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, 557, here it is, triple dollar sign as the very last number you see. A strategic formula that I design to work every single day. Said it would drop between the 26th and the 4th. Straight. Ladies and gentlemen, 3178. I can tell I won't be here long. We got 2:23 a.m., ladies and gentlemen. I promised my only big money pattern on fire to drop between 1122 and 1129 and did. Ladies and gentlemen, your 9152. Ladies and gentlemen, I guaranteed my top three numbers. If you look and see, the prerequisite to join is to win. You need to focus on my top five four digits, which I promised the first two, and triple dollar signs and fire. I say these numbers will manifest from 1122 to 1129. I also guarantee the number 123. There it is in writing, the number 3 number. I went a step further and met the deadline on 5921. Ladies and gentlemen, 986, triple dollar sign. Promised it would manifest between the dates 11/26 and 12/4. Ladies and gentlemen, 204. There it is, 420, triple dollar sign between the 26 to 12/3. Ladies and gentlemen, I went a little crazy. Promised it over and over and over again. As you can see, I was working at 2:56 a.m. Ladies and gentlemen, straight. Ladies and gentlemen, stop playing with me. I won't play with you. 3090. I circled the wrong number on that one, but we did have it. We got 9684, ladies and gentlemen. Triple dollar sign, same day to manifest. Ladies and gentlemen, 721 promised to manifest straight in Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, 577, as you can see, I promised my only big money pattern on fire would manifest straight. There you have it, between 1120 and 1127. Ladies and gentlemen, 1626. Ladies and gentlemen, 1266, one of my favorites, the only number on fire. You should have saw it. 1126 to 123, Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, 2673. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I triple dollar signed it and I met my deadline on that big money pattern. I said you would see it between 1120 and 1127. Ladies and gentlemen, I guaranteed it to manifest 1125 to 122. Ladies and gentlemen, 371. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised it would manifest top two. If you follow winning instructions and you know that that's the prerequisite, ladies and gentlemen, to win, you focus on the top five. But you should know, I promise the first two. 1, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, 308. Ladies and gentlemen, number one motherfucking big money pattern, straight. 1121 to 1128. Ladies and gentlemen, you got 535. Ladies and gentlemen, only motherfucking number on fire to manifest between 1122 and 1129. Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 824. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my top two numbers would manifest same day, straight. You can see it right there for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, 409. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my top two big money patterns would manifest straight between the dates 1125 and 122. Ladies and gentlemen, You got your 291, ladies and gentlemen, 291, 1123 to 1130. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised that big money pattern would manifest 1125 to 122. Ladies and gentlemen, 0316, there you have it, triple dollar sign as proof. I knew what big money pattern that was going to manifest. North Carolina, 4, North Carolina. You better stop playing with me. Ladies and gentlemen, 1948. Ladies and gentlemen, triple dollar signed it for Tennessee. Said it would drop between 1124 and 121. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 726. I met my deadline and promised it with triple dollar signs. 726, manifest straight. Ladies and gentlemen, there is your 880. Ladies and gentlemen, I triple dollar sign and promised my very last number would manifest first as proof. Ladies and gentlemen, for the dates 1126 to 123. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, 9002, you can see I said the same day 009 deuce would drop. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your quad zeros. Ladies and gentlemen, quad zeros between 1121 and 1128. I showed off a little bit. I promised it would fall straight and meet the deadline, but ain't nobody listening to me. I got it on there somewhere, but y'all not seeing it. Ladies and gentlemen, you got to see this right here for yourself. You're 828 on fire. Only number on fire. How can you miss it? A 5-year can identify and pick out fire. Ladies and gentlemen, you see your 006. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my only big money pattern on fire would manifest. You can see it right there. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, 3259. I promised it would meet its deadline. And guess what? I showed off a little bit. 2395, triple dollar signed it and put it on there twice to make it even more nice so you wouldn't have any question on what the fuck to do. But ain't nobody listening. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, you got your, what is that? 5983. Number one motherfucking number. Boom, boom, boom. I said you would see it between 1124 and 121. Nobody's listening. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 616. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my triple dollar signs right there. Last number. That's the very last number you see. Ladies and gentlemen, went a little crazy and gave it to you over and over and over again. Same day manifestation, 616. Straight! I said it would drop on 1127. Ladies and gentlemen, showed off a little bit. Big money pattern, straight! 2 times, 1121 to 1128. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 964. I promised my motherfucking number one big money pattern would manifest straight. 1123 to 1130. That was for Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 1467. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Triple dollar sign as proof you would see my big money pattern manifest. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 6589. Number one. Hold on. Is that 6589? Nope. 6588. 6588. 6588. Straight. Number one number. How can you miss it? How can you miss it? Number one number. Number one number. Ladies and gentlemen, they try to play with me. I play with them. Look at this. 046. Ladies and gentlemen, 064. Promise my top 2 big money patterns would make it by the deadline. Ladies and gentlemen, they drop a, what do they call it? A double draw with 851. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised 851 would manifest, but nobody's listening. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm done. I'll see everybody at the winner's table, no matter what. Abundant prosperity in health and in wealth to all who follow me and believe in the hard work that you see me accomplishing every single day. And I will not fail. I cannot fail. This right here is in my blood. This right here is cosmetic. Okay? I'm telling you, when you see all of the numbers that I am telling you will fall straight, and you're still denying that I'm not from the future, but I bring the future to you real motherfucking time every motherfucking day. Come on now. I'm going to see you all at the winner's table, no matter what.